somehow we've got to work out how those grunts then evolved into this remarkable linguistic capacity that we have that we have today. And it probably happened in lots of slow stages. But trying to piece the evidence together, we need to look at not only the fossil evidence for how the vocal tract develops, the artificial evidence for how people are behaving, but also draw on modern day linguistics, neuroscience, and genomics, and try and piece all those puzzle pieces together, which is why I call it a language puzzle. And some argue this is the greatest puzzle in science we've got to understand how language evolved.
And when we're looking at the steps in the evolution of language, are we looking at changes in the brain, or are we looking at a situation whereby the architecture was already there and we just learned how to do a new trick?
No, I think we're definitely looking at everything, in fact, because when you speak, you've got all this amazing stuff happening in your brain. You're finding the right words, you're putting them in the right order, you're using the right intonation, you're responding to what somebody else is saying. But it's also part of your body as well, because you've got huge control of your muscles in your vocal tract and your breathing to be able to actually generate those words and make them sound right. So looking at in evolutionary terms, we've got to look at both the evolution of the human body and the evolution of the brain. And the brain's got two aspects to it. It's got increasing size, so you've got actually the cognitive capacity, but probably more importantly is how it's all networked inside. And of course, as an archaeologist, I can look at how brain size gradually gets larger through time, but trying to work out how the neural networks inside are connected up to deliver the most sophisticated type of language that we use today is a bit more of a challenge. But that's where modern genomics is really contributing now. Now that we can see the difference between, say, Neanderthal genomes and modern human genomes, we can see that some of the differences are probably related to the last stages of our language capacity.
Right. I mean, this feels like the sort of question that you'd ask someone in sort of a kitchen after a trip to a nightclub, but nonetheless, I'm going to ask it anyway. Does that mean that if you could sort of go back to our caveman ancestors and bring one as a baby to the world today, they wouldn't necessarily be able to learn to speak as you and I can speak?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a great experiment to do, totally unethical and all that business. And people did try it, that's not dissimilar to what people did in the 1950s with chimpanzees. They put them in families and tried to get them to speak like humans. I mean, now it would never pass any ethical test at all. But imagine if you brought a baby Neanderthal, put him into your family and let him grow up in that surroundings. I think they develop some level of language capacity that we have today. But they would really struggle with some aspects of language. And I think the aspects that struggle with would be the more creative things, particularly metaphor. When you're just chatting on the politics just now, you had metaphor after metaphor in what you're saying. Like you said, I was struck by something in the budget and Suella Braverman was sacked, and suddenly you're talking about Kylie Minogue and things. And I think that's where Neanderthals would struggle. They don't get those sort of really creative connections. They could talk about really concrete things, things that you can see and feel and touch, but not so much the more imaginative, abstract aspects. And it was those abstract words, the use of metaphor, that really transformed language in the latter stages of human evolution at about 100,000 years ago. And that's when, the whole history of the world changed, because humans spread out of Africa. They then invented agriculture and then towns. And within 10,000 years, you're there sitting in your radio studio, talking with this, vastly sophisticated language that you use today. So I think language transformed the mind, it transformed society. It was the most fundamental change in humanity, in all of our human evolution.
And do we think that language is what enabled us to evolve in this way? What enabled us to leave? I mean, leave the Stone Age, or is it something that we sort of developed? I mean, I guess the point is, which comes first, I suppose, is the question I'm asking.
Yeah, well, some aspects of language certainly came first. I think you can go right back to Homo erectus 1.6 million years ago, and there's a first words there, and the lexicon grammar gradually evolves, gradually gets a bit more complicated, up until about 150, 100,000 years ago. Homo sapiens, were present by 300,000 years ago. But then there's some change. There's some change in human behavior, and we suddenly start making art. We seem to have a lot of symbols. We start making radical new tools. We start dispersing. And I think, and archaeologists have struggled for years to try to understand what was that change in humanity about 100,000 years ago. And I think it's a change in language. I think we evolved a new step in language, and it changed our ability to think creatively, to invent, to develop, to communicate. And that then pushed us out throughout the globe. And, pretty rapidly, all other types of humans went extinct. Well, we interbred with the Neanderthals. We probably conversed with them and so forth, but they went extinct. Homo erectus went extinct. And culture just rapidly developed so quickly from a Stone Age hunter-gatherer existence that we'd had way back to 2 million years ago, in 10,000 years through the agriculture, industrial revolutions, and the digital revolutions. And I think that's because of language. I think language drives all of our creativity, our invention, and everything we do today. And we know how powerful and potent and dangerous words can be in so many ways.
Are there some sort of like outdated, old-fashioned theories of all this stuff that you've cast away in the book, like things that people sort of believed even 50 years ago that have been dispensed with now?
Well, academics debating language, we all have different views and so forth. And one of the most prominent has been, of course, Noam Chomsky since 1950s. And he argued that at some time, a special bit of the brain evolved, which gave us what he called universal grammar. And this enabled particularly babies and children to pick up any particular language as their first language. And there was a special language learning device. Well, recent research in both linguistics and neuroscience genomics has suggested that that's entirely wrong. And in fact, what we do when we learn language, we use just general purpose learning mechanisms. Babies, they just follow lots of different statistical regularities in the way we speak, and they identify words and they learn the meaning of them. So there's a big sea change away from thinking that the brain has got a devoted language learning area in, or devoted structures for language, to recognizing that it's in fact the capacity lies in the whole network of connections in the brain without anything. There's no specific language gene.
I understand.
There's lots of languages, genes that contribute to language, but nothing that you could say take out to the brain and say that removes language. So that's a big sea change, really, in how we view the brain and how language comes around.
My last question, I think, is we're low on time, but this is a very head-scratching one. When we see today distinct languages, when humanity started speaking, would many distinct languages have evolved simultaneously, or would people with primitive language all have been able to understand each other perhaps more easily than I could understand somebody from Japan?
No, I'm sure right from the start, as soon as communities were living apart, their languages were evolving quite differently and quite separately. That's an automatic process. Language is continuously changing, and that would happen right from early times. So I think the Neanderthals, we talk about the Neanderthals having Neanderthal language. I think there have been lots of different languages there. And in some ways, they may have been a bit more complex and more difficult to understand than we have today. So there's always been linguistic diversity. And today there's about 7,000 different languages in the world. I reckon if you go back 100,000 years, there would have probably been 50,000 languages, or even more, because people were living in smaller, more isolated communities.
Right. Well, I mean, look, pleasure to speak to you, Stephen Mithen, and what a delight that you speak my language so I could understand the fascinating things you were saying.
That's great, isn't it?
Yeah, real joy.